You've looked at your fingertips 1,000 times, the swirls and ridges that let you grip a coffee cup, unlock your phone, leave traces on everything you touch. But those patterns aren't random decorations. They're a genetic timestamp coded into your skin before you were born, carrying information about something far bigger than you might expect. Your fingerprints hold clues about your ancestry, not in some mystical way, but through measurable biological patterns that scientists have tracked across continents and centuries. The loops, whorls, and arches pressed into your fingertips right now reflect migration routes your ancestors took thousands of years ago. Let me show you what I mean. There are only 3 basic fingerprint patterns that exist in humans. Loops, where ridges enter from one side and exit the same side. Whorls, circular or spiral patterns that don't exit. And arches, where ridges enter one side and flow out the other in a wave. That's it. 3 fundamental designs. But here's what makes this fascinating. These 3 patterns don't appear equally across the world. Not even close. If you're of European descent, odds are overwhelming that most of your fingers show loop patterns. We're talking 60 to 70% of all your fingerprints. Loops dominate European populations to a degree that's statistically impossible to ignore. Scientists mapping fingerprint distributions across Europe found this consistency from Ireland to Greece, Scandinavia to Spain. The pattern holds. Now travel east. In populations across East Asia, particularly in China, Japan and Korea, something shifts dramatically. Whorls become far more common. In some East Asian groups, whorl patterns appear on 45 to 50% of fingers, nearly double the European rate. That's not a minor variation, that's a genetic signature written in ridge formations, and it gets more specific. Researchers studying Han Chinese populations discovered that northern and southern groups show measurably different whorl frequencies. Migration patterns within China itself left fingerprint evidence. People who never wrote down their family history, who left no records, still carry proof of where their ancestors lived in the ridges of their skin. Africa tells yet another story. Across sub-Saharan African populations, loops remain most common, but arch patterns appear at notably higher rates than anywhere else on Earth. Arches are the rarest fingerprint type globally, showing up on maybe 5% of fingers in most populations. But in certain African groups, that number climbs to 10 or even 15%. It's a distinct marker, subtle but measurable. What causes these differences? The answer formed in the womb, in a process so precise it's almost unsettling. Between the 10th and 16th week of pregnancy, your fingertips were developing their ridge patterns. The exact formation depended on a combination of genetic instructions and the microenvironment inside the amniotic sac. Pressure, position, the flow of amniotic fluid over developing fingers, all of it shaped the final pattern. Here's the critical part. The genetic component that influences whether you develop loops, whorls, or arches is inherited. It's passed down through populations over generations. When groups of people stayed isolated for thousands of years, these fingerprint distributions became population markers as distinct as language or blood type. Scientists don't fully understand every gene involved yet. This isn't a simple one gene, one pattern situation. Multiple genetic factors interact, which is why even identical twins don't have matching fingerprints. The environmental influences in the womb make each person's prints unique. But the underlying tendency toward certain pattern types, that's genetic, that's ancestral. And researchers have used this. Forensic anthropologists examining unidentified remains sometimes analyze fingerprint patterns as one piece of evidence suggesting ancestry. It's not definitive alone, but combined with other skeletal markers, it helps build a profile. Law enforcement databases have noticed these population-level distributions when analyzing prints from different regions. The most revealing studies came from looking at isolated populations, island communities in the Pacific, remote villages in the Andes, groups that had limited genetic mixing for hundreds of generations. Their fingerprint distributions became highly specific. Researchers could identify regional patterns with startling accuracy. A set of fingerprints from someone of Polynesian descent looks measurably different from someone of Andean descent, who looks different from someone of Basque descent. But migration changes everything. As populations moved and intermixed, these clean patterns blurred. Someone with mixed European and East Asian heritage might show an intermediate whorl percentage. African diaspora populations carry their arch frequencies wherever they settled. Your fingerprints become a biological average of your ancestral sources. There's something almost poetic about it. While nations rose and fell, while languages evolved and died, while cultural practices transformed beyond recognition, these tiny ridge patterns persisted. They're one of the most stable genetic markers humans carry. You can change your name, your language, your religion, your entire cultural identity. Your fingerprints don't care. They still whisper about people who lived and died centuries before your great-grandparents were born. Modern genetic testing has mostly overshadowed fingerprint analysis for ancestry research. A saliva sample can tell you far more detailed information about your heritage than your fingertips ever could. But there's something immediate about fingerprints. You don't need a lab. You don't need to wait for results. The evidence is already there, pressed into your skin, visible under the right light. And we're only beginning to understand the full story. Recent research has started identifying specific genetic variants associated with fingerprint patterns. Scientists mapped regions on chromosomes that influence ridge formation. As we decode more of the human genome, the connection between DNA and these physical patterns becomes clearer. What nobody expected to find was how these patterns connect to other traits. That's where this gets strange. Your fingerprint type correlates with characteristics that have nothing to do with your hands. And those connections reveal something profound about how human populations adapted to their environments over thousands of years. Researchers discovered that fingerprint patterns correlate with disease susceptibility. People with higher whorl counts show different rates of certain genetic conditions compared to those with predominantly arches. The connection isn't random. The same developmental pathways that shape your fingerprints also influence other body systems. One study found that specific fingerprint patterns appear more frequently in people with congenital heart defects. Another linked certain ridge configurations to schizophrenia risk. These aren't fortune-telling markers. They're developmental signatures. When something affects fetal development broadly, it often leaves traces in multiple systems simultaneously, including the skin on your fingertips. The most studied connection involves dermatoglyphics and chromosomal disorders. Down syndrome produces characteristic fingerprint changes. So does Turner syndrome. Medical geneticists sometimes examine infant fingerprints as part of diagnostic workups, looking for pattern disruptions that suggest developmental issues. But the environmental correlations are where this crosses into population history. Fingerprint patterns shifted as human groups adapted to different climates and lifestyles, and those shifts tell stories about survival. Take high-altitude populations, communities that have lived in mountainous regions for thousands of years, places like Tibet and the Andes, show distinctive fingerprint distributions. The same genetic adaptations that help them process oxygen more efficiently in thin air also influence their dermatoglyphics. You can't separate the two. The body doesn't compartmentalize like that. Arctic populations develop their own pattern signatures. The Inuit and other groups native to extreme northern latitudes carry fingerprint distributions measurably different from populations at similar latitudes in Scandinavia. Different ancestral origins, different adaptive pressures, different ridge patterns. Heat adaptation left marks too. Populations from equatorial Africa, the Amazon basin, Southeast Asian tropics. Each developed under intense selection pressure for heat tolerance, disease resistance, and metabolic efficiency. Those same evolutionary forces shaped the proteins that built their fingerprints during fetal development. Nobody planned this. Evolution doesn't work with intention. But when a genetic variant improves survival in a specific environment, it's spread through that population. And if that variant happened to also influence fingerprint formation, the pattern spread with it. This is why your fingerprints are archaeological evidence. They're not just about you. They're about thousands of years of your ancestors surviving in specific places under specific pressures. The ridges on your fingers are tiny monuments to adaptation. Modern migration has scrambled these signals dramatically. Someone Someone born in New York might carry genetic variants from 4 continents. Their fingerprint pattern becomes a biological average, a blend that wouldn't have existed 200 years ago. The clean population's signatures are dissolving, but they're not gone. Even in heavily mixed populations, statistical analysis can detect ancestral components. Your fingerprints might not tell a simple story anymore, but they still tell a true one. The percentages just became more complex. Forensic scientists have known about these population differences for decades. When they find prints at a crime scene, they don't just look for matches, they note the pattern types. In some cases, that information helps narrow suspect pools or identify unknown victims. It's not profiling, it's biology. The same principle applies to historical mysteries. Unidentified bodies, skeletal remains, cold cases. When other identifying information is lost, fingerprints sometimes survive. On mummified tissue, in rare preservation conditions, even occasionally on handled objects. Those patterns can suggest ancestry when nothing else remains. Ancient DNA analysis has become the gold standard for this kind of work, but fingerprint evidence still matters. It's faster, cheaper, and doesn't destroy samples. For preliminary analysis, or when DNA is degraded, dermatoglyphics provide a backup option. What's emerging now is even stranger. Researchers are finding that fingerprint patterns correlate with cognitive traits. Pattern complexity, ridge density, and specific formations show weak but measurable associations with problem-solving ability, spatial reasoning, even personality factors like openness to experience. The effect sizes are small, you can't predict someone's intelligence from their thumbprint, but at the population level, the correlations persist across multiple studies. Whatever shapes our fingerprints during development apparently also influences neural architecture in subtle ways. This makes evolutionary sense. Brain development and skin development happen simultaneously in the womb, guided by overlapping genetic instructions. Variations that affected one system often touch the other. Selection pressure on cognitive ability would inadvertently drag fingerprint patterns along for the ride. Different environments demanded different cognitive adaptations. Navigation across open oceans required different mental tools than tracking game through dense forests or managing irrigation systems in river valleys. As populations specialized, their neurological signatures diverged slightly, and their fingerprints recorded the shift. You're carrying evidence of problems your ancestors solved. The ridges on your fingers are faint echoes of challenges faced by people who never knew what a fingerprint was. They survived long enough to reproduce, and their biological signatures flowed forward through time until they reached you. Look at your fingertips again. Those patterns formed before you took your first breath, encoded by instructions written across thousands of generations. They mark you as part of a specific human lineage that traveled specific paths and survived specific trials. Some of those trials were geographical, mountains, deserts, frozen tundras. Others were biological, diseases, parasites, food scarcity. A few were social, competition, cooperation, innovation. All of it left genetic traces. Some of those traces became visible on your hands. Nobody else in human history has your exact fingerprints, but millions of people share your pattern tendencies, your ridge densities, your whorl percentages. They're scattered across the planet now, but if you traced everyone's ancestry back far enough, you'd find common ground, shared environments, shared adaptations, shared prints. Your fingerprints aren't just identification markers. They're historical documents written in protein and preserved in skin. They're proof that biology remembers what history forgets. Every time you press your thumb against glass, you're leaving an impression that connects directly to the deepest human past. That's what makes them extraordinary. Not their uniqueness, but their continuity across time itself. The next time you unlock your phone or press your finger against a window, pause for a second. Those ridges aren't just yours. They're echoes of people who crossed ice bridges, survived plagues, and adapted to worlds you'll never see. Your fingerprints are a message from the past, written in skin, waiting to be read.